We are at a turning point. Urgent action is needed to change course and transform the future. Everyone alive today has a tremendous obligation to future generations to ensure that their world is one of human rights, abundance, and not scarcity. Education is one of the key ways we address inequality, exclusion, and work on healing our damaged planet. But to transform the world, education needs to be transformed. UNESCO launched its Futures of Education initiative to bring the world together to reimagine how education can shape the future. Despite the urgency of action and in conditions of great uncertainty, we have reason to be full of hope. Education can help us make a peaceful, just, and sustainable world. For this, we need to renew education by asking what that we do now should be continued, what should be abandoned, and what needs to be invented afresh. A new social contract for education needs to be built. Collectively, we must strengthen education as a global common good. Let's all work together in our communities and across the world to ensure that education best supports our shared futures.
I think you can start, Prof.
Thank you, Prof. Makwe. In Southern Africa, it's just gone 2 minutes past 3, so it's fitting for me to say good afternoon, and I hope every one of you there are in the afternoon. My name is Dzulkifli Abdul Razak. I'm the holder of the endowed UNESCO Chair on Open Distance Learning at UNISA, and I'm facilitator for this plenary session. We have 2 people that are going to be featuring here. It's Keith Holmes, I see he's in here. Keith, you have 10 minutes to do the introductions, and Keith will be followed by Professor Asha Kanwar, who is the CEO of the Commonwealth of Learning, who will, I think, has about 20 minutes to make a presentation. And without further ado, can I hand over to you, Keith, to get rolling?
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to meet you all again. I'm very happy to add my welcome to the second day of this conference, and really to express my appreciation to UNISA for hosting the event. And I wanted to also thank our colleagues at the UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean for their contribution to the event and the sub-theme of the World Higher Education Conference on the Futures of Higher Education. So my name's Keith Holmes. I'm based at the UNESCO Paris office in the Future of Learning and Innovation team. And I think yesterday's presentations and discussions clearly demonstrated the value of collaboration and cooperation in the field of higher education and what we are doing today on reimagining the futures of higher education towards 2050. So my role is to provide a kind of introduction to day 2, which today is on policy engagement on the futures of higher education. And we're really looking forward to hearing from Asha Kanwar, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Commonwealth of Learning, and the keynote address by Dzulkifli Abdul Razak, the Rector of the International Islamic University of Malaysia, as well as regional perspectives on the futures of higher education. We will be having the breakaway sessions to reflect on emerging policy concepts. But I thought I would start by reflecting on some of the issues raised yesterday and some implications for policy engagement, which of course is full of complex dilemmas. Okay, so I'll start with the first dilemma, really, is the plural futures. Since on one hand, we are saying that there are many possible futures and many desirable futures of societies and higher education, then at the same time, we're trying to say that this conference is somehow to make a difference and to contribute to reinventing higher education for the future and breaking with the past. So in other words, there are obvious implications for policy dialogue, policy making, and policy implementation. But the problem is we have different desirable futures for higher education, which would necessarily require different policies for their realization. So that's the first dilemma we have is plural futures. The second dilemma is really, well, who are the policy makers? You know, who are policy makers in higher education? So if we would like to make policy recommendations, then who should we be addressing them to? Because on one hand, we're saying that the autonomy and academic freedom of higher education institutions must be defended and valued. Yet we know that higher education institutions operate within wider governance arrangements and in the context of social, economic, and environmental policies that may enable or constrain their transformation. So higher education institutions cannot achieve what they want to become by themselves alone. And we know that the extent of autonomy varies between countries. There are many different kinds of higher education institutions, a different mix of public and private institutions. So higher education encompasses an enormous range of actors, central and local, and there are also other stakeholders, such as youth and students, who have not yet been adequately involved in policy processes. Then we know public policy processes are multi-level, from local to global. So institutional or national level policies are necessary, but also insufficient for higher education to contribute to the global common good. So at governmental level, policy development needs interministerial cooperation and policy dialogue. At country level, social dialogue needs to involve everybody, including, as I said, children, youth, students, but also faculty, administrators, taxpayers, who have a stake in the future of higher education. And the perspectives and knowledge of historically marginalized and disadvantaged populations are especially important for rethinking inclusion and equity. Then at the regional level, there are very important policy frameworks in education. Yet regional cooperation is also not enough. Policy learning should take place within and between regions. So international policy frameworks, such as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, provide a basis. But then 2030 is only 8 years away. So dialogue is needed across societies, between governments, but also between higher education authorities, institutions, employers, unions, civil society organizations, social movements, and others. I'm very pleased that we have the UNESCO Chair on Open Distance Learning from UNISA here. Since the unit to UNESCO 30 years ago is one kind of international network that has tried to advance and model inter-university cooperation through knowledge sharing, exchange, and collaborative research projects. And there are other networks too. So that second dilemma was, well, who are the policy makers? The third dilemma, of course, is what to recommend, supposing we would like to make recommendations. And we would be looking at key policy concepts today. But let me say, one of the insights I got from yesterday is that perhaps the line between reimagining futures and policy making is a lot thinner than it might first appear. So whereas other higher education conferences might jump straight into a policy debate, set of policy issues, our conference has helpfully spent the whole first day on reimagining and re-envisaging. We thought about how we would like communities to look in 2050 and what types of activities will be taking place in these communities. And we heard different visions for the future of higher education for the benefit of all. So I think this conference is actually an experiment. And we want to see whether thinking about the futures of higher education, like we did yesterday, actually changes the types of policy discussions we will have today. But the challenge ahead may, in fact, be partly to do with the culture of decision-making. The policy community often thinks in terms of past realities, and a very pervasive concept of evidence-based policymaking, which is based on past experience. Yet if the future is really uncertain and unpredictable, then what has happened even in the recent past might not be then a reliable guide for future policies. But policymakers have to still justify the policies for funding. And these policies are often designed for a future that has not yet happened. but policymakers have to appeal to evidence. The evidence they use often has its origins in higher education research, and those policymakers themselves are often graduates of higher education. So there's a little bit of inertia we can see, because well-established areas of policy such as financing, governance, inclusion, equity, research assessment, quality assurance, qualifications, learning pathways, internationalization, and so on, are already in existence. Yet policies are needed that could incentivize collaboration over individualism, interdisciplinary research over disciplinary silos, knowledge sharing and open science over knowledge enclosures. So what policies would be needed to foster epistemological diversity, include indigenous knowledge systems, so that they're truly valued and appreciated by higher education and institutions? So reflecting on the futures of higher education might help us not only to reflect on the relations between these policy areas, but also to develop new policy areas that need attention. We've heard about the importance of human rights, sustainability, empathy, solidarity, and cooperation, and the idea that higher education should produce graduates and researchers who can reimagine individual and collective futures. What policies would it take to develop the University of the Social Imagination by 2072, to recall Kerry Facer's story? So rather than making specific recommendations for policy, it might be as useful to recommend new policy concepts or different approaches to policy development, including methodologies for envisaging desirable futures and possible approaches to scenario development. Although it's not a blueprint, the report of the International Commission on the Futures of Education calls for a new social contract to repair the injustices of the past while transforming the future. It's also relevant to higher education. Instead of a top-down model, a new social contract implies implicit agreement among members of society to cooperate for shared benefit. It assumes interaction between top and bottom and horizontally between societies. It means examining foundational principles on how we organize and improve education and learning throughout life. The second main insight, and this is really my last point, is that the line between futures of higher education and society change, the futures of society, is very thin as well. Indeed, this conference is not only contributing to building higher education outwards from what exists today, but we started by envisaging the societies we would like to have, and how society is organized largely has reflected the organization of knowledge in higher education and its disciplines, professional fields, policy areas, and so on. So there's a possibility, looking to 2050 and beyond, that higher education can not only be shaped by policies and external trends such as the IT revolution, EdTech, and AI, but higher education itself can contribute more to policy processes. Indeed, higher education, we learnt, has to create its own futures and not find itself part of futures constructed by others. For our work on the futures of education, and particularly the futures of higher education at UNESCO, I think one of the most useful recent resources is the work of the independent expert group on the universities and the 2030 agenda. This report focuses on and advocates three main areas of higher education transformation: the need to move towards interdisciplinary and transdisciplinarity in education and research, the imperative for institutions to be more open, fostering epistemic dialogue and integrating other ways of knowing, and a demand for a much stronger presence in society through proactive outreach activities, partnering with social actors, building awareness of ecological deterioration, and actually influencing policy. So the potential for higher education to shape the future should not be underestimated. I will end my reflections with one recommendation only, that higher education could do more to recognize and fulfill higher education's own roles and responsibilities for influencing policies for social justice and the common global good. Starting with policies for higher education, as we are doing together today, could be a powerful contribution to our common future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Keith. And maybe what's the technical aspect? Carlos, are we having a video of Prof. Asha Kanwar as yet?
Yes, can we have a video of Prof. Asha Kanwar?
Yes, let's have the recording. Thank you.
Distinguished colleagues, thank you for the invitation to be part of this important discussion on the future of higher education. My topic today is sustainable higher education, policy issues. But first, a word about my organization, the Commonwealth of Learning. CALL is an intergovernmental organization, as you know, with the mission to help Commonwealth member states and institutions to use distance learning and technologies for expanding access to education and training. CALL uses technologies to promote learning for sustainable development. This means that learning must promote economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental conservation. Does higher education within the current paradigm achieve these objectives? In this presentation, I will begin by outlining some of the key issues of our times and the impact of these on education, especially during the pandemic. I will then look at how some universities adopted the sustainability agenda over the years. And finally, I will conclude with some of the persistent challenges and the policies needed to build the sustainable higher education that we want. Let us first look at the three key issues that impact education in both developed and developing countries. These are the delays in achieving Sustainable Development Goal 4, the disruptions caused by the pandemic over the past 2 years, and the increased manifestation of climate-related disasters. First, as we know, SDG 4 aspires to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning for all by 2030. Even before the pandemic, it was clear that the global community was far from achieving the targets it had set for itself. If we are to reach our goals for education and lifelong learning, the annual investment in low and lower middle income countries will have to be doubled. Further, quality education will need a threefold increase in spending for every primary school student. And even if countries did invest in these additional amounts, there's no guarantee that the poorest children will benefit. Data from some countries suggests that the poorest schools get $10 for every $100 spent in mainstream schools. Second, as the pandemic engulfed the world, we found the greatest challenge related to digital infrastructure, lack of access to devices, connectivity, electricity. Teachers were not prepared for the sudden transition to online learning, and existing inequalities were further exacerbated. Most institutions had to pivot to emergency remote teaching. Many did not have adequate technology infrastructure. The mobility of international students plummeted, with countries losing large revenues from student fees. Budget cuts were imposed by governments, and research reliant on practical work and external collaborations suffered the most. A study in the US and Canada revealed that over 50% of the teachers required help with supporting remote students. They needed access to digital materials and wanted assistance with technology. There is a learning crisis in most countries, and a study in the Netherlands records a learning loss of about 3 percentile points, with higher losses among students from less educated homes. Third, the climate crisis is escalating, especially for the Commonwealth with its 32 small states, which are disproportionately affected by climate change. Even here in Canada, we have seen temperatures rise to 50 degrees centigrade forest fires and floods, all during this year. And the education sector, from primary to tertiary, contributes to both direct and indirect emissions with an impact on environmental degradation and associated economic costs. If we look strictly at contributions to emissions, the achievement of SDG 4 under the current paradigm could potentially worsen the climate crisis. So how can we respond urgently and effectively? How did the higher education sector respond to the pandemic? We have seen a wide range of developments that could help us shape a sustainable future. One has been the phenomenal increase in MOOC enrollments, not just of global brands such as Coursera, but also universities which had hesitated to offer online courses, came forward to offer MOOCs, especially for professional development. The Call Coursera Workforce Recovery Initiative skilled and reskilled over 150,000 Commonwealth citizens in the last 18 months. So how can we use such initiatives to reach the last mile? The pandemic has also seen the second coming of video learning, where teachers made significant contributions, often reaching their students through mobile devices. Call's video-on-demand service brought quality content to low-bandwidth contexts in the Pacific. Formal assessments and proctoring systems suffered major setbacks during this time, where institutions were forced to adopt innovative approaches to build flexible models and make assessment more authentic. The University of South Africa, UNISA, developed app-based assessments. Griffith University in Australia used oral assessments for their business program, and India introduced open book exams at scale. Open educational resources were in high demand as teachers looked for quality digital content. In a North American study conducted during the pandemic, 44% of administrators were positive about faculty use of OER, while a quarter of teachers believed that OER could contribute significantly to teaching and learning. A recent Call survey found that there had been a 50% increase in the use of OER across the Commonwealth during the pandemic. The mobility of international students plummeted with travel restrictions and the closure of borders. This led to new partnerships and highlighted the need for hybrid models and branch campuses, which could provide an opportunity for students to experience affordable internationalization at home. The recent EDUCAUSE Horizon report sums up 6 new trends in higher education: the widening of the digital divide, increased use of hybrid learning, demand for new skills, a focus on sustainable development, and a decrease in funding. Respondents were also asked to pick the top technology trends and practices. The results were not surprising, with artificial intelligence topping the list, followed by blended course models, learning analytics, and micro-credentials. OER and quality online learning were also considered very important. So how can we harness the potential of technologies to build sustainable higher education? Let us now briefly reflect on what we understand by sustainable higher education. The global community included higher education in Sustainable Development Goal 4. Targets include ensuring equal access to affordable and quality tertiary education, and that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills to promote sustainable development. Over the past 50 years, one option for offering affordable quality higher education was the establishment of open universities. The 33 open universities in the Commonwealth provide quality education to over 5 million learners annually at a fraction of the costs of campus institutions. In addition, adopting distance and online learning can promote environmental sustainability. The SUSTEACH project, supported by the Open University UK, compared the carbon emissions of ICT-enhanced and in-person courses and found that distance teaching models had significantly lower environmental impacts. COL also conducted a similar study in Botswana and found that the average learning-related carbon footprint of the distance learning group was 1/3 as compared to their campus counterparts. In the past 3 decades, several initiatives have emerged to promote sustainability in higher education. As Caird and Roy sum up, these are related to greening the curriculum, greening the campus, and using distance and online learning. The University of the Philippines and Simon Fraser University in Canada offer specialized courses in environmental literacy. The University of Pretoria has adopted a transdisciplinary approach to curriculum, enhancing community-based learning experiences and the agile shift to virtual teaching for sustainability. Several universities, including the Australian National University and Groningen, have strategies in place to green the campus and reduce emissions through adopting renewable energy and promoting resource conservation. So what have we learned from these different initiatives in promoting sustainable higher education? One, that the sustainability agenda has to move from pilot phase to becoming mainstream. Two, in countries where resources and incentives were provided, this agenda was more successful, as we also see in the case of the United States. Partnerships and platforms have been very effective in helping advocacy efforts and sharing best practice. For these initiatives to achieve scale, we need committed leadership at the management, student, and community levels. So what is the way forward, and how can we build on existing experience to develop the policies we need? The only silver lining during this pandemic has been the global acceptance of online learning. A recent study in the UK found that the majority of higher education students rated the quality of online learning as excellent. But in many other instances, the emergency response did not provide quality teaching and learning. We have also seen that purely online options do not work for everyone. The future will be a blend of online and in-person approaches using a range of technologies that are affordable and accessible. Because of existing digital divides, technology to be effectively harnessed must be placed in an appropriate social, cultural, and political context. Since most ministries will need to work with existing rather than enhanced budgets, the realistic option would be to reallocate the funds available and invest in clicks, not bricks. How can we develop policies that will provide an enabling framework for making access to affordable devices and connectivity for learners, what role will the private sector play? The second issue is that blended and hybrid models provide opportunities for learning to those who cannot access purely online provision. Traditionally, open and distance learning has always adopted a blended approach, keeping in mind issues of social justice. Research shows that blended learning is more effective in developing countries. Research also shows that there is no significant difference between distance and traditional classroom instruction in terms of learning outcomes. Yet there is a lingering perception that distance education is not as effective as class-based education. And similarly, a study found that while face-to-face costs per participants in a teacher training course were about $6.7 US, the same training was offered online at half the costs with comparable outcomes. We need more ministries to develop open and distance learning policies to create an ecosystem of lifelong learning for all. One example of a multi-layered framework for open learning is India, where the government has set up public open universities, a national open school, an open platform for teacher training at scale, and sharing quality educational content online as a free resource. Policies need to start with the last mile. Current policies tend to prioritize serving mainstream learners. We find that open and distance learning benefits women, persons with disabilities, as well as disadvantaged communities. Governments need to adopt a targeted approach to reach these marginalized groups first, which will, by default, serve the center better. Sustainable higher education will also need to reach the bottom billion. Access to quality content can be a way forward and shared through technologies that are appropriate to different contexts. At the Commonwealth of Learning, we used a tool called Mobi MOOC, which offers online learning through basic feature mobile phones to deliver lifelong learning to agriculture students and farming communities in local languages. Open educational resources have shown to increase access, reduce costs, and improve learning outcomes in some of the studies conducted in Antigua and Barbuda, Malaysia, and the USA. And even though OER are being proactively promoted over the past 2 decades, the uptake has been slow. One reason could be that competition is part of the DNA of universities. UNESCO's recent report on Reimagining Our Futures Together stresses the need for collaboration and the principles of equity and inclusion. Pedagogy must move from emphasizing individual achievement to accomplishment that benefits society, and teaching must become a collaborative endeavor. This is a valuable blueprint for higher education for the future. And to achieve this, we need policies and incentives that promote collaboration and resource sharing at all levels. And then finally, as the climate crisis assumes greater urgency, we need to transform higher education to inculcate sustainable behaviors. CALL supported the development of a green teacher program in India and Nigeria to help teachers inculcate environmental concerns among learners. CALL offered MOOCs on business for sustainable development and on understanding the blue economy with universities in Mauritius and the Seychelles. Sustainable higher education will need to push the frontiers of knowledge and focus on emerging and future skills related to renewable energies, the protection of forests and oceans, and offer practical solutions to avert the crisis. Research in science and a culture of innovation will be central to this agenda. Universities, in short, will need to adopt a green learning agenda as Christine Kwok proposes. This agenda would focus on developing the skills for green jobs that would help make the transition to a low-carbon economy, green life skills for a more sustainable future, and skills for a green transformation that addresses social justice. Governments and institutions will need to develop policies for a greener, fairer future. In short, the 4 policy pillars for sustainable higher education relate to technology, open and distance learning, collaboration and sharing, and investing in a green learning agenda. These policy interventions will lead to sustainable higher education. This means that higher education that is sustainable must be affordable and accessible for all. It also means that universities will need to align more closely with the needs of their societies and promote research for sustainable development. And finally, universities must play a leadership role in modeling sustainable behaviors that lead to the prosperity of the people and the planet. So with that, let me thank you for your kind attention.
Well, thank you for that informative and really on-point presentation that really picks up the very key issues that affect the world following the advent of the outbreak of COVID-19. I think sustainability, greening the schools, greening the environment, but also being responsive to the needs of the community. To me, those are paramount issues. I think at this stage, without taking time, I was wondering if people have comments or questions. I hope Prof. Asha Kanwar is in the house for part of this session of exchange and conversations. Carlos, am I right? I don't see her on my screen.
I don't see her on the screen, but you can go ahead and hand over to the next facilitator.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. I think this was a very insightful session. As Prof. Malko says, in the absence of Prof. Kanwar, I was wondering if people would like to have anything to say on the issues of policy that Keith raised, because I don't want to sound like I'm overshadowing him. I'll pause to see if people have things to say. Doesn't look like. In that case, I want to thank you very much, all of you, for being in attendance. And let me now take this opportunity to hand over to the next facilitator. I think it's for the keynote address. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Prof. Litseka. And to Prof. Asha Kanwar and to Keith for these wonderful presentations. My task is to usher in the next speaker who's going to do the keynote, and that is Professor Dzulkifli Razak. Assalamu alaikum, Prof.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
He's so kind. He actually shortened his name with the fear that someone might not be able to call it. That's very kind. Yeah, you are welcome to South Africa virtually, and we are looking forward to this engagement. I will, for the sake of saving time, read his short bio, then I will put it on the chat so that people can engage with it further. Prof is the rector of the International Islamic University of Malaysia. He's an expert for the Futures of Higher Education project at UNESCO's Institute for Higher Education. Prof has received numerous awards. He's been a vice chancellor at the USM from 2000 to 2011. Prof, we are really honored to have you here. Those who would like to read your bio further, I'll put it on the chat.
Thank you.
Please, you can carry on. Thank you. Bismillah, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have given you my video. You're going to show my video, right? So I'm indeed very glad to be here. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. Greeting of peace. A very good day to all of you. Let me first of all take this opportunity to thank the organizer, particularly UNESCO and the University of South Africa, for allowing me to share my views on this very important topic of reimagining the futures of sustainable higher education towards 2050. This is indeed a topic that is close to our hearts, and all of us in higher education are struggling to find out what the future means for us, particularly given the pandemic. On that note, I would like to welcome you and thank you for participating and also contributing to this idea of the futures of the sustainable higher education towards 2050. Let me begin by introducing you very briefly my university, which is the International Islamic University of Malaysia, that is established in 1983, will be 40 years, 2 years from now. And this is a university that dedicates itself to higher education, particularly for the vulnerable, for the people who have not had an opportunity for higher education anywhere around the world. It is an Islamic university, yet it is not only for Muslims and the Islamic world. We serve the entire humanity, and we are hoping that the futures of higher education will be moving towards those directions. I would like to introduce you very quickly some of the credentials that the university has got over the last few years. We have been recognized by UNESCO for the UNESCO Chair of Future Studies on Anticipation for Sustainability and Well-being just a few months ago. Last year, we were awarded the International Award for Institution for Sustainability for the year 2020. And this recognizes the activities that we've been devoting ourselves to on sustainable development. Before that, we are humbly recognized by the United Nations University in Tokyo as a regional centers of expertise for sustainable development within our own region called the Greater Gombak. These are the three accolades that I would like to introduce to you to give you some confidence that the work that we are doing has been recognized and to a certain extent has also given some ideas of what the futures of the university are all about, which I will elaborate a little bit on this particular keynote that I'll be giving you today. Let me try and give you the context of what the discussion will be all about. I think all of us agree that moving forward will be uncertain, ambiguous. Some people call it complex. Yeah? But these are the issues that I think we are all confronting, but none of us, at least not me, are prepared for this. And therefore, how do you go about in trying to find this balance into what we call this chaotic world? If we are unable to do that, the crisis ahead will be daunting. Added with the pandemic, we probably will not be able to deliver education the way it should be delivered, given all these other challenges in front of us and more challenges to come if you are not careful in how to handling the situation ahead of us. To do that, I would like to share with you what the university is all about. First of all, the vision of the university itself is quite unique. Unlike many of the universities that I know, here we talk about the betterment of human life and civilization. It is not just about the university. It is not just about Malaysia. It is not just about a community or a group of community, but it's also about humanity as such. And here I think the 4 keywords that is important to ensure betterment of human life and civilization are the word trustership, that is translated from the word Khalifah, also stewardship to a certain extent, the word trust or values of trustworthiness, which is translated from the word Amana, and last but not least is the word knowledge, which is translated from the word Iqra, that not only means recitation, but also reflection, translation, and also making things real at the same time. In other words, not just theoretical knowledge, but knowledge which has practical values for the relevant period that it is meant for. The Rahmatan lil Alamin, which means mercy to all. In other words, as I mentioned, it's not confined to any segment or any sector or any population, but it is directed to humanity as a whole, not only human life, but also non-human life and the environment around it, as the outcome of this leading the way that we are trying to forge as far as university is concerned. Yeah? For that, all of this must be seen in a perspective that is interrelated with one another, although it has its own sort of emphasis, but it has to be interrelated with another so that at the end of the day, we can culminate it into what we call the value of education in our own context, and that context is what I use the word sejahtera in the indigenous terms of the word. The word sejahtera is about balance, is about harmony, is about fairness, is about equitability, is also about how to build relationship across whatever sector you are in. And it is not new because in many society, in many culture, they have something which is equivalent. In Japan, they have this word ikigai. In Sweden, the word lagom means not too much, not too little, just enough in a context of balance. Africa has got the word ubuntu, I am because you are. Again, this context of relationship, creating balance, fairness, justice. And certainly, I think all of us understand the word yin yang from Chinese, again, talking about balance and so on and so forth. In our part of the world, the Malay archipelago or the Nusantara, the word is sejahtera. And sejahtera will be the driving force as far as moving ahead in creating a future of education that has its own context within this particular part of the world that could then relate to other parts of the world, as I've just to demonstrate in different cultures and different sectors where the word sejahtera has got its own connection with its culture across human heritage. This becomes more important now with the pandemic, that this whole idea of living together across same value system, even the terminology may be different, but the values are the same. How then we can interrelate with one another and build education around it? In other words, it is not a false sort of a creation. It is almost an organic creation because all of us has got the same values. Now we need to build around it so that we can interrelate with one another in a more natural and an organic way. So to do that, I think we need to understand a little bit of what this sejahtera is all about. It has 3 dimensions at the first level that talks about spirituality, the emotional dimension of the person, and all governed to an ethical dimension. And this ethical dimension is where the value are cast. That this ethical dimension will keep everything in its own sort of perspective so that everybody will have a fair share and experiencing the same justice. In other words, we look at education in the context of sejahtera as a leveler of society as such. Built on this, then we will build the cognitive part, the intellectual part, and also the psychological part at the same time. This then adds to what I call the microcosm, the dimension that we need to educate ourselves within before we begin to educate anything around us. Until and unless we experience peace, until and unless we know what harmony is all about, it's just difficult to dispense peace and harmony because we have never experienced it. So the idea of trying to educate ourselves before we educate other people will be the fundamental values as far as the new education or the future education is all about, so that the balance between the mind and the heart becomes something which is real. Oftentimes when we talk about education today, the heart is not involved. It's very much an intellectual activity where the heart has no place at all. Suddenly with the pandemic, we find that emotions becomes important, the question of mental health becomes important, and the question of heart becomes important. How do you bring this into the fold of the new education system is something that we want to understand and how to make it happen. To do this, I think we need to create this micro balance, and this micro balance will then allow us to function in the macro balance, which is the world outside us, be it the ecological dimension, be it the economic dimension, cultural, and also the societal dimension. These are four dimensions that defines the macrocosm. We are supposed to interact, we are supposed to deliver, or in fact, we are supposed to learn from one another within this dimension. If we are not prepared for this, then I think we will not be able to deliver the best that we could. At the end of the day, we also want to see a kind of a balance, not only the micro balance, but also the macro balance. And this macro balance and the micro balance will be the final objective of what education would be like in the future. How do you maintain this balance between the human person and his environment? And this is where I think Sejahtera becomes into practice, how to make the balance becomes equitable as much as possible during the process of our lifetime. And that is what I call the Sejahtera principle of balance, which future education hopefully will address. If this is done, then we find that at the end of the day, we will be able to deliver many of the things that we have sought to deliver over a period of time. This is one example that I will share with you. In the year 2021, some of the achievements that we have made in trying to bring this balance into full, in trying to make it relevant, in trying to convert it into something which is impactful rather than putting it just on a piece of paper as part of publication and so on and so forth. These are some of the highlights that I want to share with you that gives us confidence. If we push the way we want to push it, using the framework that we have created for ourselves, we will be able to make a dent as far as the education of the future in 2050 is concerned. These red dots that I have earmarked for you are some of the achievements that we've got, be it in terms of education, be it in terms of energy saving, be it in terms of looking at what the future is all about when you talk about your UNESCO chair and all the other accolades that we have got to show and to give us confidence that we are in the right track in trying to usher the new way of education moving forward using sustainable development as one of the pillars and creating a sustainable higher education towards 2050. Given the mission of the statement, the vision of the statement that I mentioned to you earlier, I want to demonstrate three things that is happening to us. Before I came into this university, one thing that we notice is everything is in a siloed form. These are an example of the three faculties or the three kuliah that we talked about, or rather the four kuliah that we talked about in university. They are almost on their own. They are not interacting with one another the way we want it to be, and they are almost in their own silo sets as well. What we did in the last 1 year, the whole of 2019, was to break the silos and to make sure that this university works together as a common platform in trying to achieve whatever knowledge we think it is necessary, not only for the university, but for the community around it. And this is what we call the flagship initiative. A flagship initiative is a platform for everybody to come together on the notion of what the flagship is all about. By definition, this flagship means the ship in a fleet which carries a commanding admiral, the best or the most important things owned or produced by a particular organization, in this case, our university. There are many things in the university that we are proud of, that we think we can share with the world around us, but we need to organize ourselves to make sure that this flagship really has a kind of a commanding position so that we can share with other people around the world. Perhaps it is difficult for us to understand the flagship in the context of what it is now. I would like to share what happens in the motor industry. A classical example is the Ferrari. It is a flagship, the Ferrari, for the year 1984 to 2013. And you can see for every other year, there is a flagship car as far as Ferrari is concerned. And what strikes me, not only they are consistently read, in other words, that's the brand, what Ferrari is trying to move forward, but every year when the car is produced, they are produced in limited numbers. They are not a mass production kind of a thing, where university tend to be now, and therefore, to a certain extent, losing its own sort of quality and its own sort of attraction as far as what the flagship means. So this is a flagship that we are trying to build, and over a period of time, I will share you some of these flagship programs that we are now able to push forward in trying to create what a future university would be like by the year 2050. Now, on that note, I think we've started to understand this flagship and use sustainable development goal as one of the drivers to move it forward. Very early in the 1980s, we started to demonstrate this through some of these conferences, and this is the one that is in Malaysia in the 2019, the SDG Summit, and we begin to introduce the idea of flagship and how sustainable development works within this particular framework. To meet one of the mission of the university, which is mission number 2, that talks about balanced progress as well as sustainable development, we use then sustainable development as a key platform, as I've mentioned to you. Then in the year 2020, as we begin to understand sustainable development, suddenly we are struck by another unanticipated sort of crisis, which is the COVID-19, and I'm sure all of us know about this. And therefore, the flagship suddenly turns into something which is quite different. We talk about the flagship in the context of COVID-19. How do you actually move the flagship in trying to control, if not mitigate, and understand what this COVID-19 is all about as another challenge for us to move forward in terms of education. Suddenly, we are faced with lockdowns, not one lockdown, but many lockdowns to a certain extent, and I think all of us understand this, affecting our education system, the way things are moving, and in fact, the health status of our students, particularly in the context of mental health. This allows us to do many other things. Talking about physical distancing, I think we are one of the few universities around our country that talk about physical distancing right from day one rather than social distancing, because social distancing does not give us the impact of what physical distancing is all about, the use of sanitizers, and eventually the use of face masks. This becomes an added dimension to what the flagship is all about. How do you actually get into another motion of solidarity in trying to face this kind of adversity, maintaining what we call now the standard operational behavior so that we can also push away the COVID-19 infection as far as the population and the university is concerned. On that note, I think we are able to understand that the communities and sustainable development are moving together. And this is another chart that talks about the community is important in trying to get into a solidarity state, the bonding state, and therefore the concept of physical distancing is important vis-a-vis social distancing. Social distancing gives you another implication as far as the community behavior is concerned. And therefore, we use sustainable development once again to understand how people can work together given some of these goals that we have seen. Goal number 1, goal number 2, goal number 3, which is about hunger, which is about poverty, and which is about cleanliness and health, which is very fundamental as far as COVID-19 is concerned. And how this then adds on to the goal number 16, which is about creating peace, and goal number 17 is about working together as far as partnership is concerned. This will be then the framework that we are working to push or to change education moving forward in the year 2030 and beyond to 2050. As you can see in the last slides, I showed you an idea of what education is all about as far as we're concerned, but you can see that we have added on what we call SDG 18. Because on introspection, we see that there is another kind of bonding that we need to promote, which is what we call the spiritual bonding. And the university now is working on SDG 18. We hope that spiritual bonding will add on to what we call the physical distancing. Although physically we are apart, but spiritually, as human beings, as humanity, we are kept together through the spiritual sort of understanding and living, defending, and also caring with one another. So that is the flagship that we are creating for the year 2020 and beyond, in other words, in trying to understand how do we now work or at least, protect ourselves from this infection. There are documents that talk about how to use sustainable development to arrive at no one left behind. And this is again a document that describes very much the things that we do in trying to bring people together in understanding what the pandemic is all about. The other goal or the mission that we are talking about is about intercultural understanding and fostering civilizational dialogue. The year 2021 brought us another challenge when we talk about the vaccines. And therefore, the flagship turns itself into another sort of platform where we take vaccines into account as a mode of trying to control, if not manage, what the COVID-19 is all about. Yeah? That picture that you see in front of you now is a university organizing itself into what we call the vaccine center, where we invite population around the university to have their own vaccination free of charge provided by the university and the government at the same time. This becomes almost an automatic sort of contribution of the university to the community so that everyone in the community are looked after as far as vaccination is concerned. You do understand that vaccination has its own politics, has its own reality, where some people has got better chance of being vaccinated as compared to some others. The idea that we are creating here, what we call the high-touch engagement, is to make sure that everybody actually is vaccinated and not being left behind. And this is one of the platforms that allows us to actually create a solidarity among our university. And this is more important for me because suddenly during that particular period of time, we were inundated with heavy downfall. Rains for months on end, that some of the community that is now being left behind are also faced with another sort of calamities of floods and so on and so forth. We see people are stranded in many locations, and that adds on to the kind of solidarity that we need in terms of education. This is almost to me like a test of how functional this flagship is and how relevant it is when it comes to solving challenges that is unexpected. And I'm happy to report to you that our student responds almost like duck to water. Everybody takes their role going out to the community. We have to organize now buses, 700, 800 of them leave almost every day to the community around them to make sure that they are safe, to make sure they are moved into safer places, and also to make sure that their houses are cleaned. once the flood has subsided. And this becomes a routine activity almost for the 1 or 2 months, that the student came back to me and reported, we learned a lot more when we work with the community in those state of affairs rather than staying in our library or our lab and lecture halls. These are things that we cannot get from the textbooks. And these are the things that I think we want because we become relevant as far as the community is concerned. In other words, our students are really prepared to move on the ground, given the flagship, given the kind of framework that we've prepared for them, so that at the end of the day, they become a positive contributor to the community, and hopefully this will contribute to what the future of education is all about. At the end of the day, we are meeting the last mission of our university, talking about deep sense of social responsibility among staff and students. And this happens because we have got another framework which is called the Sejahtera Academic Framework, which actually combines a number of things. Not only the mission statements and the vision statements that I talked to you about, not only the national philosophy of education that this country has got, but also it relates to other goals like the Sustainable Development Goal, like Education for Sustainable Development, like UNESCO 4 Pillars of Learning, or indeed the 5 Pillars of Learning with Learning to Become. All these are mixed together to create what we call the transformative, value-based future academic direction. In other words, IIUM has already prepared itself to realign with these major goals of not only meeting education for 2030, but also 2040 and indeed 2050 as we move on, where the entire student experience becomes an important contribution to the future of education, not only in terms of its theory, but also in terms of its experience and the practical being translating knowledge into reality. That has been our thrust for the last 3 or 4 years. That has been our move forward in creating what future sustainable higher education would look like. Given this framework, we are able to translate it into a larger plan, which is a scenario plan, and is part of the UNESCO Chairs for the Future, that we have now got our own image of where the university will be in the year 2040. So it becomes quite good for us that we have got Education 2030, we have got our own Education 2040, and now we are talking about Education 2050, all well realigned in trying to create what the future higher education will look like at the end of the day. Let me summarize what I have said in these one slides to understand where we have gone through given the experiences of the last couple of years. As I've mentioned earlier, we started with a very different kind of organization that is siloed, that is segmented, and have very little interaction with one another. And in fact, that is a starting point as far as trying to change the university moving into the future. What we did, therefore, is to identify what are the platforms that is necessary to break down the silos. And as mentioned, we work on an integrated, transformative sort of transdisciplinary platform so that people can come together and break down as much walls as possible and interact with one another. And for that, we also change the kind of evaluation that is necessary. It's no longer now the conventional exams, but the exams could be something that talks about not just achievements of the end product, but more importantly, the development of thinking and also knowledge producing at the same time. Often there is no exams, so that students can experience and understand what education and knowledge is all about. This allows us then to talk about how to move the university away from just the environment of the university. In other words, connecting ourselves with the community around us, be community engaged, and more importantly, trying to transform the community, at the same time the university, as part and parcel of one holistic community that is responsible for each other. And that requires another set of activities that moves us away from the comfort zone of just doing research and also acting on something which is very theoretical rather than with practical reality, solving real issues in real time. And this is where the whole idea of trying to create the kind of students which is quite different from what it used to be. We look at the students as a whole person that has different needs and different wants, and therefore different diversity that needs to be answered to, which is provided by the Sejahtera academic framework. And the academic framework is the one that drives the student into creating a new learning environment that at the end of the day not only talks about the impact factors, the KPIs as we call it, but also the impact on the ground, the real impact on the ground that we can really feel, touch, and sometimes see. And this is what we call the KIP, which is the key intangible performance. To quote Einstein, not everything that can be counted counts, but not everything that counts can be counted. I think often we have left that the KIP, the things that is counted, but because we can't count it, and therefore it just left on its own. We are trying to bring this back so that when we talk about a whole institution transformation, we are actually talking about as much as possible, not only the tangibles, but also the intangibles, including the attitudes, including the beliefs, including the values at the same time that adds on to what education would be about. And therefore, it is about connecting the dots, not only connecting the dots within the university's environment, but also connecting the dot with other players at the same time, especially in the community. They have got their own understanding of what knowledge is all about. Often they have got wisdom that we have forgotten. And how do you bring this back so that we can humanize education? So that education is about creating better human beings, that we can live together in peace and harmony the way we talked about it in Sustainable Development Goal 16, partnering with one another, which is Sustainable Development Goal 17, and answering all the other goals that we are supposed to meet by the year 2030 and beyond. So these are the issues that I think we have been grappling with. And if we are able to do this, we are beginning to see what we call the whole society transformation. In other words, the university not only works for itself, but they also responsible in bringing communities together with them, and they grow together, as our mission has stated, betterment for human life and civilization, meeting what the university is intended for, not only for itself, but for humanity as a whole. So on that note, I would like to thank you for your kind attention, and I hope the little experience that we've got will be able to spark some ideas of where we need to move as far as education for sustainable development towards 2050 is concerned. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum and a greeting of peace.
You are here, so I'll allow you. Yes, thank you so much for the presentation, and it is very thought-provoking and enlightening. I will allow you, Prof, to respond to the questions and comments on the Q&A, and also some are on the chat.
Which one are these?
Okay, let me read. Then
yeah,
you
read. Yes, please.
Yes, the first one is from Ziad Said. He says, a question to Prof. What 21st century skills are delivered within the ESD context?
I think the skills are basically human skills. Our ESD is basically human-centric. I think sometimes we talk about ESD more of an environmental stuff, and sometimes even economic and stuff like that. So ours, we are very sure that it has to be human-centric. In other words, the human values are the one that we need to understand. For example, when you talk about
modern education now, we talk about, I call the 3 M's, manpower, what you call training the minds, and also working with machines, high techs. That I think is too constraining. I think we need to move now in terms of just human power. How do you then work with humanity? In other words, understanding the people around you. The world is such now, if you don't even understand your neighbor or you don't even care your neighbor, you can forget about humanity. But are we doing that? Are we very concerned about our neighborhood, the community that we're working on? Very often universities are just about themselves. For example, my university will probably progress into an international university, but there's a community around my university taking the same leap. Or are they being left behind? So I think these are the skills that we want to connect. It is the same skill. It's not rocket science as far as I can see. How do you connect the university, the community, based on the human needs, based on human dignity, and based on humanitarian value? The moment you can connect that, I think we can get it done as soon as possible. The way we have demonstrated in the last 2 years, I am myself surprised that the student wants this, because the students feel they've been isolated in their own environment, in the university, with the gates and stuff like that, that they are not reaching out to other people. And the COVID makes sure that they are connected. I think that's the only trick, I think, for moving forward.
Thank you, Prof. Then the next one is a comment from Zainul. He says, Tan Sri Zul, I'm looking forward to engage with the UNESCO Chair of Future Studies in IIUM. Then the next question is from Tuli. It says, I'm interested to find out if there were enabling policies at national level that enabled this transformation journey, or was it driven more from the university level?
Yeah, I think like any third world countries, I think basically we have been distracted over what is happening in the North. If the North do not take on sustainable development as a kind of a benchmark, and we talk about the ranking and the league tables, many of them do not even talk about sustainable development per se. We tend to withdraw also because we think this is not important. And that's why I say the context is very much important. As far as we're concerned, we think that we need to create our own context. And this is where I go back to the mission of the university, which is about betterment of human life and civilization. It doesn't really matter what the government wants, but this is what the university wants. And therefore, we created our own framework, as it were. And this is a policy that we're talking about. I showed you the what you call the Sejahtera academic framework, which is galvanized by the whole university. We sat down for 2 years and say, what is it that we want? We do research and look at what is useful and what is not useful. The university has been here for 40 years. What needs to be discarded? What needs to be added on? And I think this kind of meeting of the minds about the university put us in a framework that we are very comfortable in trying to move forward, although the government's policy are not ready. And alhamdulillah, now with us doing this, now we becomes a focus of what is it that we do right that the government can take on and other universities can take on. In fact, we are now trying to redefine what the university of the future is about on 4 things. One is we thought university must be transdisciplinary. You just cannot be focusing on one specialty and think you can solve the problem. It will not work. So how much the university can go into transdisciplinary, including not only dominant knowledge, but also indigenous knowledge. We work with the indigenous people. We find that they're more knowledgeable than us as far as sustainable is concerned. And how do you then bring this back? We cannot discard them and say they are marginalized and therefore they are not good for us. We need to bring them back. How do you give them that kind of a platform to come back? Secondly, is to work with the community themselves. The university in the South is very much focused on industry. We have been promised by the industry to give us job and so on and so forth, which is fine. But until the COVID comes in, jobs do not matter anymore. You know, who bails us out? The community bails us out. And therefore, the community, I think, has a lot more impact on us if we give them the right direction and the right platform to work on. So community engagement is as good as industry, but we need to then work and focus on what is the community's wants and how do you work with them. The third dimension is about responsible research. You use the word responsible research. In other words, the research that we do, we must make sure there is a need for it in the community, and the community must be involved from day one right to the end. In other words, they will be the evaluator, they will assess us and say, this is what we want, and this is what I think is not going right. It is not just about impact factor, all these number games that we are being caught with, because it doesn't serve any good for the university as far as I can see. And the last dimension is, of course, collaboration. Competition, I think, is making us miserable in the sense that we begin to hawk knowledge, we begin to hawk skill because we don't want to share with other people just because we don't want to be outperformed by them. Now we are talking about this sharing thing, collaboration. Everybody must share and learn from one another. And this is where I think the basis of humanity becomes a real sort of platform. And I hope these are the 3 or 4 things that we can work on if we massage this into the meaning of what university would be like as far as 2050 is concerned. For our what do you call this, another book here, you don't see this, the scenario plan, we already realigned it, what we need for 2040, and maybe add on for another 10 years for 2050, inshallah.
Thank you so much. And then I'm going to give you 2 more questions, and then we can close. The other question is from Professor Muhammad Ali in Canada. He says, thank you for your presentation, Prof. Razak. What can other countries learn from your country's experience?
Well, I think that's a big question. I think what can the country learn from itself? I think we should start from there. I think our mistake has always been learning from others and trying to import it. And when we import it, somehow or other, it doesn't meet into our requirement. I think we all need to ask, what is it that we can learn from ourselves and then expand it? Once you know what you need to learn from yourself, given your environment, your civilization, your values, so that you don't get forsaken on this. But the moment we start with somebody else's value, then we need to adjust so many things that sometimes do not belong to us. This is how we start. We find out what is it that we need, and then we look at other models and see, is this something that's relevant to us? So in other words, we don't lose our priority. We don't lose our own, culture, as it were, but yet we can connect with other people and we don't feel strange. Right now, most of our education are westernized. I'm not saying westernized is not good, but where is our part of education? Where are the African part of education? Where's the Asian part of education? Westernized alone do not solve the problem as we see it now, then we need to add on. And the moment we add on, then I think we get the diversity. Sometimes the solution is in the society itself, just that we are not aware of. The moment we work into them, then we find that many of the solutions will come up quite naturally. As I said just now, it's almost an organic way of solving it, rather forcing it into the community. So we start with ourselves, with our own confidence, and I think with our own culture, then I think we can move forward, inshallah.
Yes, then there's a question from Martha Buckle. She says, this is a good comparison, mass production or elitist access. So she's asking, do you have any recommendations on how to give access to higher education to many while preserving quality of access, curriculum, etc.?
Right. I think basically I quite agree with you. This whole idea of mass production is not the way to do it more. In this COVID environment now, what we're seeing is that some of the isolated communities can actually emerge with something that they are good at. So in other words, all along, we are trying to make education a one-size-fits-all. Now, suddenly we find different community can educate in a different way that meets their own needs. I mean, they may not be even going to digitalization because they don't need it. Why do you need to force it onto them? They're good at something else. Let them prosper on that. Later on, they will go into this digital. I am quite worried when we talk about the digital world, everybody must be digitalized now. Already studies have been shown, I think McGill studies, I think last week, shows that as far as handphone is concerned, China is the most addicted country. Next is Saudi Arabia, and next is Malaysia. Where are the Germans? The Germans are the least addicted to technology. The Japanese are the least addicted to technology. Because we do not have this technology and we do not know how to use them, then we are caught into another social problem. And this is what I think we need to learn. Doesn't mean that we talk with digitalization, we need to jump on the bandwagon. We need to understand who we are and whether we need it or not. Once we make that decision, then we know where to put this digital thing, not a kind of one-size-fits-all again. Some society, I'm sure, can survive without it because they've got other things that they want to do better. And sometimes people can also learn from them because they have different way of doing or dishing education from that point of view. So there is no one size fits all. And this is where I like this whole exercise of the futures of education. The plurality, I think we should not miss it. We talk about plural education, but most of the conclusion becomes almost mono. You know, you lose the diversity. It has to be these 4 things. It has to be these 5 things. You know, where is the diversity when you take the futures? We somehow rather lose the future when we conclude. And I hope we don't run into this problem when we try to conclude in this seminar, inshallah.
Then the question, this one is from an MEd student. I'm glad there's a grad student from Canada. Her name is Missy. She says you spoke of the importance of balance. What would you be able to share? What would you be able to share? Would you be able to share your thoughts to explain that low number of female top leadership, given the high female participation and achievement at all other levels?
Well, in terms of gender, as far as my university is concerned, although it's an Islamic university, I must confess that I think 60% of the students are female. You know, I think there are more active female students. There are more achieving female students as compared to the male students. I don't know for what reason, but I can see when you move into a humanizing education, the human dimension becomes more important. And I tend to feel that the women are more in touch with humanity rather than the men. The men are, you know, somewhere, we have been trained to be something else, but not as human as the female. And therefore, the traits being female, I think is an important trait that we men need to realize and to learn also. And I think that's a part of the new education when we talk about the post-COVID. It is no longer a man's world. You know, it's a world that who can deliver better given the circumstances. And the circumstances, when you talk about mental health, I think the males are not as good as the female in trying to manage it. Our counselors are mostly female. It's not by coincidence, I think, because they are naturally given to it. So this issue of gender, I think, needs to be rediscussed on a different framework altogether. It's not about feminism, but it's about equity in terms of, you know, the gender sort of distribution and role and function in the new society, I think.
Shukran jazilan, Prof.
My pleasure.
I'm seeing even in the comments, this has been so engaging, and I think everyone is appreciative. It's a pity we cannot clap hands because we are in this platform. Thank you so much. Please, you may excuse yourself. Then let me invite Professor Romila Mohi to facilitate the next session. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sindile. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have to start by saying that I very much like that last comment. Of course, the whole presentation of Professor Razak, but the last comment about women are much better at mental health and are much better at so many things. Right. So this afternoon on this topic of policy engagement on the futures of higher education, I'm very pleased to welcome a number of panelists from different regions. Actually, the regions we are going to cover are going to be Africa, Arab states, Europe and North America, Latin America and the Caribbean. And this then will be followed by some discussion and by a video. So the first speaker we have for this session is Miss Carolyn. Maybe I'm not pronouncing the name well, is Miss Carolyn Medel-Anonuevo, who is the head of education unit of the UNESCO Regional Office for Southern Africa. Carolyn has worked extensively to promote education in the region and has a number of publications in matters regarding literacy, gender, advocacy, amongst others. Without further ado, I'll now ask Carolyn if she's around, if she could deliver her speech, please. Thank you. 10 minutes, Carolyn.
Thank you, Romila. I asked permission to share my screen, but I already mentioned that it has disabled, but I'm still seeing that I cannot share my screen. This is technology. I just want to ask the organizers to please allow me to share the screen. I told them already beforehand that I was going to share my screen. but I think I'm not yet able to
Please
share.
try now. Okay.
You should be able to.
So Carolyn, can you share now?
Yes, okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So as Romila was saying, and I would just like to say that this afternoon's 10 minutes presentation is about our work with SADC on the futures of education, co-creating a post-COVID-19 higher education and TVET strategic framework. And I'm so happy that Somila, our moderator, Romila is part of this initiative. And just to give you an idea, our expectation is that we had to bring together experts of higher education, TVET, ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, and Digitalization. We met 3 times virtually, and then finally we had a meeting last November in Cape Town, where the idea was to co-create a draft Futures of Education and Learning strategic framework. And after this draft, we hope we can present this to senior officials. Now, unlike many of the discussions, which are basically university-driven, university policy, our work is, as UNESCO, is really working with governments, and we hope that the outcome of this we will be able to present to the SADC ministerial meeting in June 2022. Now, as we have all been hearing, the futures discourse is not new, so we have been guided by OECD 2015, and then of course UNESCO's Future of Education 2019, and even in Southern Africa, there's a large number of work, especially in South Africa, on futures of education. So we are building on this, and even for for UNESCO, we have Greening TVET, we have ESD, we have a roadmap. I hope many of you are familiar with this. And just recently, there's the UN strategy for TVET. And of course, there has been reference to this, the futures of education work. So our work is actually not only higher education, but it's a way also of building bridges between TVET and higher education. And of course, as we are Southern Africa, we are based on the African documents like the Agenda 2063, the Africa We Want, which is also very visionary. We have the Continental Education Strategy for Africa. And of course, there's a TVET strategy of Africa. So, and specifically in SADC, there's no higher education strategy per se, but there's a strategy for TVET from 2018 to 2027. There was an existing strategy before, which we helped craft, and this present one, UNESCO and ILO were useful. We're providing technical and financial assistance. And of course, at the country level, so you have global, regional, and at the country level, there are many initiatives which are looking at futures of education, future of work. South Africa has been leading this, and we now have Namibia, where the government, the president is very much into fourth industrial revolution, and what does it mean, future of work, future of education. So we have been building on that and conscious that it's not isolated, but building on existing government initiatives. And so in the SADC Strategic Indicative Development Plan, one of the more important pillars is social and human capital development, where higher education is very much important. And of course, youth, environment, climate change, disaster risk management. Now, I just like to also say that in trying to think of the future of education in the region, we are conscious of the reports in the World Economic Forum Global Report, where it's saying that, for example, in 2025, 53% will be done by humans and 47% by machines. This is quite a substantial difference from 2020. And the challenge of creating decent human-centered work is getting harder, and more we're hearing about artificial intelligence. And of course, we also have these skills. What kind of skills? Everybody's talking about skills, but even we see that analytical thinking, innovation, creativity is growing. and declining is manual dexterity, reading, writing, technology installation. And even if you, and that was just 2022, 2020, and in 2025, you will see that the first two are still analytical thinking and innovation, active learning and learning strategies. But creativity, originality, and initiative was the third, but in 2025, it's complex problem solving, it's critical thinking. So even the skills that are needed is very important. It's also rapidly changing. And just to give you a gender perspective, this is the kind of skills that are the future skills, but we see that share of women, even if women are doing well in many things in the future, to what extent are women going to be involved? And we saw, for example, the importance of digitalization. COVID-19 has put to scale remote working, digitalization, and automation. So what does that mean for higher education and TVET? We know that we will, just in 2022, 101 days of learning, and we need to be reskilling. So how are universities and TVET institutions preparing for that? I think what's important is not only about whether it's a mass education, quality education, then we've heard a lot about elitist education, but I think one of the important areas of the future of work, futures of education, is that public commitment to education as a common good, and expanding the understanding of the right to education, meaning higher education, university education should be looked at as a common good, as a public good. And also the right to education is not only basic and secondary, but also tertiary education. So that is even, I think that's a mind shift. And I think that's an important element of the futures of education. And I just have 2 slides. And in fact, the challenge is how do we revision education and navigating plural realities. Southern Africa is one region, but its 16, 17 countries are very much different. And if we want to craft a SADC strategy, how do we do this? And this is my second to the last slide, because this is the recommendation coming from the Universities Association of South Africa. You know, the universities have come together and they've done a study, and that was the first one of the documents I was referring to. And I think it's important to have this. They have a lot of forward-looking prescription, but here I think it's important, a reimagined higher education system that is articulated with training and vocational colleges to enable lifelong learning and democratization of access to higher education. I think that is one important thought that we need to really unpack. Education, higher education, is it a privilege or is it a right and a public good? So with that, I end. Thank you. Thank you, Romila.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carolyn. And yes, indeed, these are thought-provoking: education as a common good or a privilege. We will keep the questions for the after the last speaker. I hope, Carolyn, you can stay with us. And I now have the pleasure to introduce Professor Ziad Said, who is a professor of applied research from the College of North Atlantic, Qatar, and from the Office of Applied Research and Innovation, and also the UNESCO Chair on TVET and Sustainable Development. Prof, can we have your speech now?
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Ziad Said. I am the UNESCO Chair on TVET and Sustainable Development, College of the North Atlantic and Qatar. UNESCO has identified 4 concerns about life to 2050 and beyond, and their link to higher education, or how university can address these concerns. First one, the quality of life, which means opportunity of access for all to higher education. This means higher education become expandable and affordable for all. Engagement in society and community to be integrated to teaching and research. This integration should be part of curriculum and campus operation, as well as the sustainability, the care for sustainability. Higher education have responsibility to address sustainability issue and as environmental, such as environmental, climatic, and other global challenge. This was also the sustainability should be a core function of higher education and their curriculum and also other campus operation. Higher education have pivotal role in increasing, developing, and sharing new technological developments. The new technological developments such as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nanomaterials, augmented reality, and all other Internet of Things and other issue related to technology. And as we know that teaching will rely strongly on this change in technology. Now, how would higher education respond? Operational models for the university will have to select one among the three models, optimizing their curriculum and operation gradually or transform directly. But most universities rely on the model that gradual adopt the realistic choice between the two options in a reasonably short period. Some university will choose not to do any modification but transform directly, or some others they may choose not to do anything, that relying on their tradition and to be resilient to their and relying on their history or future past history and adopting to any change, to other technological change. How will these changes are reflected in programs and curricula? Major programs will embrace a blended learning model. That means a combination of face-to-face delivery or class delivery and online learning. Higher education will invest in student-centric learning. That means adopting programs to become more and courses to become more interdisciplinary. That where the students will be the center of learning through project-based learning, problem-based learning, and so on. Traditional in-person classroom learning will be complemented with the new learning modalities such as live broadcasts and educational influencer, as mentioned before. Rise in higher education, public-private partnership to create learning ecosystem. Learning ecosystem means the production of books, software, videos, YouTube, and so on. Now, how could we deliver that promise of better transition between higher education and strengthening education as a public endeavor and a common good requires pedagogy to be organized around the principle of cooperation, collaboration, and solidarity, and also curricula should emphasize ecological, intercultural, and interdisciplinary learning that supports students to access and produce knowledge. How the higher education can bridge the skill gaps between the industry required skills or the employers required skills and what the higher education themselves of what their curriculum provide of skills. Now, if you look at these two graphs, these are the one at the top is a survey as a survey conducted by Qatar Foundation in 2016 and presented at WISE conference in Doha and later published by Forbes magazine. now the question was to education provider, how do they believe that, if they believe that their graduates are prepared for work. So 72% of them say yes, while only 42% of employers say yes, and only 45% of the youth, of the graduates themselves, say yes. This is an international from different countries. The second one is a local one, a local survey conducted by our research team, and that involved 125 employers from about 80 companies, and TVET provider from 9 major TVET provider, including universities and TVET institution. So these are about we ask about the perception of these 3 major sector employers and the TVET to their perception about cognitive, technological, social, interpersonal, and civic, and this category of 21st century skills. What do they think? Which skills are more important? So we have there are difference between the employers, and on one hand, and TVET on the other hand. This one in the, you see at the degree to which the skills, each category is important. Now we can see that they disagree on the different skills like cognitive, technological, and civic, and while they all agree on the importance of social and interpersonal skills, that they consider them as the most important, while TVET providers say it is not such important, but they put statistical analysis indicate that they consider it as fairly important. Now, to sum up, higher education will be based on a blended learning, university blending learning, as we described before. University will increasingly offer interdisciplinary subjects and the programs. There will be a rise in public-private partnership to develop educational assets such as physio, books, and other resources, and the greater accommodation of employers' input to program and curriculum development. This is, they have to involve these employers into their into developing the curriculum. Higher competitive market for 25 graduate and after, because they are more exposed to the new technology than the previous cohort. Regarding the artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, nanotechnology, 3D printing, Internet of Things, they will be dominating in during the education higher education program. But the robots can act as engaging educational tool, but within the classroom, but they will never replace, fully replace instructors. As we know, instruction required human interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I now have the pleasure to introduce Professor Jessica Retis from the University of Arizona. She is currently the director of the Masters in Bilingual Journalism, University of Arizona. Retis holds a major in communications, a master's in Latin American studies, and a PhD in contemporary Latin America. She has more than 2 decades of journalism experience in Peru, Mexico, and Spain. And her research areas include Latin America, international migration, diasporas, and transnational communities, bilingual journalism, and journalism education. That's a big portfolio. Retis, over to you for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have, can you put my video? Excellent.
Yeah.
Retis from the University of Arizona. My name is Jessica Retis. I am the director of the Masters in Bilingual Journalism, and I'm glad to comment that my research has been supported by the Center for University Education Scholarship. And I would like to especially thank UNESCO and the University of the Future Network for the invitation to participate in this important discussion about the future of higher education. My talk, and let me share my screen. So it's cultural responsive pedagogies and services in time of changing demographics. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the implementation, the development, implementation, and assessment of bilingual journalism program. What I'm trying to address in this discussion, put some ideas, especially about the importance of cultural responsive pedagogy and how this is important in order to better serve, prepare learners to live in a global society. Because when educators understand that learning and teaching are cultural and linguistically impacted, and they recognize that instructions is more effective when learners' broad cultural backgrounds, racial and ethnic identity and life experiences are integrated in the curriculum, educators who make themselves aware of the learner's background and life experiences are better prepared to adapt instruction in a responsive way that demonstrate that they can actually teach like their students' life really do matter. In this sense, we need to approach also this idea of servingness, significant of race when it comes to enrollment and conversion patterns of racially minoritized groups. Post-secondary institutions are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse in the United States. And servingness is a multi-dimensional and conceptual way to understand what it means to move from simply enrolling Latinx students to actually serving them. In the United States, we have a 569 Hispanic service institutions. It means that these institutions have at least 25% of Hispanic students enrolled in full-time, but it also a group of emerging HSIs. And when we see the map also corresponds at the distribution of concentration of Latinos in the United States. For example, if we see the map of the 80s and the 90s, and then the 2000s, we will see that the concentration has been growing, not only in geographical concentration, but also dispersion. The majority of Latinos that live actually in the United States right now are from Mexico. It's around 62 million, and we'll see the majority of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Salvadorian, and other Latin American countries. The interesting thing is that the growth is less from foreign-born and more US-born populations, and that reflects on higher education currently. So when it's changing demographics in general in the population, it's also changing demographics of the student body. And this is briefly some of the data from how it's changing, how the student demographics are changing in the United States. As we will see, Hispanics are growing and their participation in higher education. Because of the recession of 2008, there's a decline in birth rate. It's calculated that by 2026, the number of college-age students in the United States will have dropped by 15%. So drop in domestic college-age population, the increase in diversity, more non-traditional students, less international students, and continual adjustments to Gen Z student population are demanding some changes also in higher education. So we see in the progression the decline of international students. When it comes to Latin Americas, we have students coming from Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and also Spain. How are they in a map? If we put in an international map, we will see that the majority are from Asia, but also from Latin America, right? So we'll see that the group of Latin Americans is also a significant part of particular programs in higher education. But we will see in the case of Latinos in the United States and international students in the United States, we will see that in the 50s, we were mostly from Mexico, Cuba, and Colombia, then in the 70s and in the 80s, Venezuela, and nowadays it's more from Brazil and from Mexico. So this is more or less the evolution, and this is where they are concentrated. So one of the things that I want to address is the changing of language diversity. What does it implies? The United States is becoming the second largest Spanish language country in the world. And this is also affecting higher education and how we are going to prepare students for better serve the society. When it comes to the consumption of Spanish or English, or the usage of this language, we will see that it varies depending on age, depending on the countries of origin, the level of education, etc. But it's becoming an important element into bilingualism in the United States. In my area, which is more media and journalism, there's also changing in the media landscape, and that's important also to address when it comes to understand how we can better prepare our students in post-secondary institutions. It's very interesting to see how Spanish and English intertwine in the consumption and news media, and especially how this intertwines also in the digital arena. So what we're trying to address in this program is to try to understand what's going on, not only in the changes of demographics of the country, the changes of the demographics of the population, but also the changing of the digital arena. As we all know, we're living in the post-digital scenario right now, and we need to better understand that in order to better prepare our students. So one of the reflections that we have in this innovative program at the University of Arizona is understanding the situation of diversity, equity, and inclusion in newsrooms, and how we have a problem in representation of minoritized groups in newsrooms, and how the pipeline starts also in the universities. We're trying to address that situation by understanding the changing of higher education recruitment, retention, and course offerings, and then think about how we can implement an innovative program like the one we have at the University of Arizona in this scenario. So with all these new challenges and opportunities also that we face nowadays, we see that the general trends, as it's being published by, inside higher ed, it's to attract non-traditional adult learners, expanding online offerings, increasing the outreach to areas where population is growing, decreasing also to first-gen school generation and underrepresented students, and focusing on diversity, but interesting also on bundling master's and bachelor's degrees into smaller certificates and micro-master's programs, and making education more accessible to working adults. Also, there's a trend in partnering with employers who are increasingly investing in employee education and development. How do we, and I'm pointing out the last minutes of my participation, how we do this in this innovative bilingual journalism program? We are trying to serve the society and the future of higher education into implementing a cutting-edge program that offers professional and academic training for students who want to report about and or for Latinx communities in the United States and abroad. It's the one of the only fully bilingual programs in the country. The graduates acquire a robust set of skills both in Spanish and English that will translate to significant competitive edge in the workplace. It has an interdisciplinary agenda of research and community service pedagogies behind the creation of these masters. And it's also in collaboration with the Center of Latin American Studies, the Mexican American Studies, and the Spanish and Portuguese department. In general, we're trying also to engage in policy as well, and try to address how education systems are challenged to prepare learners to the global society, implementing cultural responsive pedagogies and serving it. HSIs, educators, administrations, and diverse students population need to be included in this understanding of the future of higher education, as well as professional organizations, policy directives, and so we can establish teaching standards. In our case, we are bringing into the discussion the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, the National Association of Latino Independent Producers, and the National Hispanic Media Coalitions. We recently have panel where we have Congressman Joaquin Castro that presented how the Hispanic Caucus has asked for federal data to understanding the lack of representation on Latinx in media industry. And I'm going to put the link of that panel if anyone wants to see that video that was recorded. And this is a proposal into trying to also impact policy and in higher education. This is what I wanted to incorporate into the discussion, and I'm going to stay for any questions that you might have in regarding to what is to examine cultural responsive pedagogy for the changing demographics of the student body, and how we have been working on implementing, implementing and assessing a bilingual program, journalism program in an Hispanic service institution in the United States. And with that, I would like to participate in the Q&A session. Happy to answer any question and happy to comment with our colleagues on the different approaches that we are implementing in preparing the students for the years to come, and how we can keep collaborating and keep having the discussion at an international and global context. Thank you very much, and greetings from Marisol.
Thank you, Professor Retis. Thank you very much for this kind of different perspective in terms of pedagogy in teaching. Let me just remind all participants that please put your questions in the question and answers or the chat. Our next speaker for this session is from Latin America and the Caribbean, more specifically from Peru. She is Professor Carmela Chavez Irigoyen, holding a PhD in sociology and is an expert in higher education. Professor Chavez is a specialist in comparative educational systems of the National Superintendents of Higher Education of the University of Peru and university lecturer at the Pacific University. Over to you, Professor Chavez, for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I guess if you can put my video. First of all, thank you very much to Professor Makini McCoy from University of South Africa, to the colleagues of the University of the Future Networks, and to UFN-UNESCO for the invitation. At portas of the third Global Conference in Higher Education, it is a privilege to share a space, to share some ideas around the future of higher education we all want, and maybe to add a tiny grain of sand in the effort to build the university we need to face the tremendous challenges we have either in terms of social or environmental sustainability all over the world. I will start this comment with a phrase I read in the report, Pathways to 250 and Beyond, Findings for a Public Consultation on the Future of Higher Education. Report made by UFN-UNESCO last year after asking how we imagine higher education over the next years to students, teachers, civil society, and university managers all over the world. And it said, expectation of higher education in multiple futures are high. In many ways, the post-pandemic scenario has shown us a world marked by huge gaps between countries, social classes, and social groups. Just seeing the profile of my own country, Peru, in 2022, the university drop rate has increased by almost 200% and almost 300% in private profit universities from 2018. The students also come from families that have more levels of expenses and more rate of family dependency. That is to say that sanitary impact has put in our faces the precariousness of the most vulnerable students. That, of course, are the ones that need more higher education, and for sure, the ones that have made the hardest effort to arrive to it. 2 years later, those indicators have changed, and fortunately, most of the academic drop has been recuperated. However, the vulnerability is still there. But this situation is not just an enrollment problem. We all have seen social and political leaders pronouncing themselves against science and modern knowledge that really saves lives. And also, we have seen the return of corruption and public voices that pretend to delegitimize democracy as a political project. In this context, What is the role of the university? How can we start building it? I can think of three main possibilities that I want to share with you. First of all, we have to change our approach related with the hegemonic paradigm that has prevailed for 30 years for now. Education should not be considered only and basically a commodity, a market, or an industry. We must recognize that education is a fundamental right and a public service. We have to return to the foundations and to be less worried about utilities, economy's return at the position in international rankings. Instead, maybe we should worry more about the access and permanence to thousands of youth who are still out of the possibilities of having higher education, or about the situation of those locked in unpayable debts for years to come because there is no public financing for them, or because they are workers, they have children, they are single moms, or have disabilities. We need affirmative actions to open opportunities, but the system do not necessarily respond to their specific needs. We need more and better higher education for all in all stages of our life. And for that, we need less market and more public policy. Secondly, quality assurance is important. In fact, having basic quality conditions is the only warranty of having equal opportunities for all, beyond of the social or cultural capital of the family. We all need libraries, good teachers, internet, labs, and some research infrastructure to learn and to teach. Universities and colleges have to develop an institutional culture for making them real. And that means not just investments, but also good practice in social and political life. We are all part of the same global society. No public policy can work if actors are not involved and make them accountable. Also, it means that the public institution and system of quality assurance have to work with independency, autonomy, and without any conflict of interest. So we need universities that make quality assurance part of their DNA and their own social university responsibility. Thirdly, I truly believe that only knowledge and science can save us from destruction and for post-truth. Vaccines work to prevent diseases. The planet Earth is a circumference. Climate change is the result of the model of production that is killing us. These are facts. We need universities that explore the facts because society needs it to be able to make better choices and to develop sensitivities and commitment in the students to defend them against conflict of interest and falsehoods. Universities need to be close to the people that are producing knowledge every day. Industry, indigenous communities, professionals, technicals. We all need to talk to each other and ask ourselves what problems we are facing day by day and work together looking for some answers. More papers and books are produced than ever before in the history. That has to mean something. Researchers have to be engaged with the sustainable of our planet, our people, our lives. The good news here is that all the evidence suggests that developing these three directions is possible. What do we need to do? To achieve changes in our approach to education, we need to transform our curriculum, not just to make more competitive professionals, but also with a broader conversation of the environment in which they act. Every professional performance will deal, in many senses, with social and environmental conflicts, with social injustice and bad practice related to pollution, exploitation, or corruption. Unfortunately, part of the technocratic ideology was dissociated the different life spheres, but we know that all of them are connected, and universities face the huge challenge of developing the critical thinking we need to put the pieces together. We can't continue to develop the economy without looking the nature and laboral rights of the people. We can't continue to apply law if we don't attend the social injustice that is the root of the most of the crimes. Curricula have to address this complexity, and each career has to put its own deontology at the service of society. We also need universities that are engaged with science, producing it and defending it in public space as a public good. Science must not be a privilege. Science has to stop suffering through illness, poverty, and exclusion. Science also has to be relevant. Practitioners need them all the time to do a better job. Health science, social science, technical science, all of them. We need better knowledge and a better distribution of it. Unfortunately, science doesn't come from the sky. It needs budgets, qualifications, quality assurance, innovation, technology, excellent professionals, papers, and evidence. So we need departments and faculties who are interested in that. Institutional incentives for research and careers, mentors, and adequate financing. Also, universities can't be alone with this goal. They need public funds and public installations. They need industries interested in developing innovation. For that, we need internal and external quality assessment system, an inclusive campus for all. Society diversity is good for science. Finally, I think about higher education in 2050. I wish I can see an humanized university that is connected with its community, that is global, but also local. In the case of Latin America, I think we are making important efforts. Most of the governance system and educational public policy are directed to quality assurance policies and also working for mechanisms of inclusion. Also, more universities are committed to academic excellence. Even in a country like Peru, where the university reforms is nowadays in profound danger, society is every day more convinced that youth and almost everyone needs and deserves good and more higher education. So, if I can sum up, which are the main concepts that have to become the sense of future universities, I will say it's inclusion, quality, and vocation for knowledge. These are the promises we have to keep for the next generation to convert those high expectations into something real. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Chavez. Our last speaker for this session is from Asia, and I would like to welcome Professor Ethel Agnes, who is the director of the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization, SIAMEO. And Dr. Ethel is the director of the SIAMEO Secretariat, which serves as the executive arm of the SIAMEO Council of Ministers of Education from 11 member states that make up SIAMEO. She's the 18th director of the Secretariat and the first woman director since SIAMEO's establishment in 1965. With these words, I welcome Professor Agnes to deliver her talk. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very
Distinguished
much. Good morning.
speakers, esteemed guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all. Today, I will discuss the future of higher education, but with Asian perspective. Asia is in the middle of historic transformation, and if it continues to follow its recent trajectory, we are thinking that by 2050, its per capita income could rise sixfold in purchasing power parity to reach Europe's level today. It would make some 3 billion additional Asians affluent by current standards, by nearly doubling its share of global gross domestic product, GDP, to 52% by 2050, Asia would regain the dominant economic position it held some 300 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution. However, at this time, we are still in the pandemic, and many of our countries, I think, are in the reset mode. Based on our discussion during the CIMIO Congress 2021, which we have titled as Reimagining the Future, getting all 35,000 participants in our event, we were able to identify key challenges and key investments to reach Asia 2050, a prosperous region. We need to invest in IT infrastructure. We need to invest in developing smart city. We need to transform our education system from K to 12 TVET and higher education. But we need to make sure that in the whole process, no one is left behind. In this reset mode, our member countries embark on newer forms of higher education, more responsive to the needs of business and industries, aligned with Industry 4.0, pioneering some alternative forms of courses and qualifications that are now made available from a wide range of providers. Some higher education institutions and training providers offer common names, including micro-credentials, masterclass, offering badges, certificates, micromasters, massive open online courses, short courses, among many others. This development is brought by technology and digitalization that have revolutionized everything. Major technological disruptions have changed our world, and disruptors continue to dominate. Automation is here to stay. In higher education, we have a big goal. We need to embrace SDG 2030. And in higher education, we set the goal for more accessible higher education under 4.B, that by 2030, substantially increase the number of scholarships available to developing countries. In particular, least developed countries, small island developing states, and African countries for enrollment in higher education, including TVET, ICT, technical engineering, and scientific programs in developed countries and other developing countries. Internationalization of higher education continued to be our common goal since 1990s, and internationalization is evolving in teaching, in curriculum, policies, student mobility, student services, extension, and even outreach. Countries in our region continue to send higher education students under scholarship to US, UK, Australia, Japan, or New Zealand, and many more other countries. Increasingly, though, more and more countries are offering as well transnational education. They are here in some of our countries to offer higher education to a bigger number of Asia's population. This trend can be seen in Singapore, Malaysia, and even Vietnam. During the pandemic, due to lockdown and travel restrictions, higher education institutions explored virtual mobility with the new market evolving. Market-driven micro-credentials, augmented reality are becoming options for many students in higher education. In our member countries, higher education institutions with their partner institutions have been active in developing courses to prepare the learners, especially during the time of pandemic. Online webinars, online courses, massive open and online courses abound. Micro-credentials as an expanded form of alternative qualification across a range of fields in higher education can also be seen trending. They are small, discrete pieces of learning now offered online globally that can be combined with other validation techniques to verify learners' demonstration of knowledge, skills, and competencies. These are non-traditional qualifications, but they are rising. Currently, however, there is no universal understanding of what micro-credential is, what its attributes are, and what values they have. So for us in policymaking in higher education, we are studying closely micro-credentials for the recognition of prior learning or credit transfer, in addition to traditional qualifications that students possess. One remarkable development also is investment in STEM education. This is one of the biggest areas where Asian economists invest in. We need high-level scientists, high-level researchers, and good infrastructure on research and development. We rely a lot on external experts and donors at this time, but we would like to march to prosperity, and this will be led by many of our countries in Asia: China, India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Thailand, and Malaysia. The combined population of these countries is 3.1 billion and the GDP of 15.1 trillion in 2010. And it is assumed that the population would be 75% and the GDP would be 90% of Asia. STEMED will continue to attract the best and the brightest. The STEMED researchers from Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam will be competitive with entrepreneurship, innovation, and technological development coming to grow in our region. Breakthrough science and technology will always be our higher education agenda. We also think that by 2050, our region will be highly urbanized. Thus, we see the need for more strong and reliable engineering education, robust accreditation, and mutual recognition of engineering education and professionals. These highly skilled professionals will be received in our region and globally, and they will transform the region into a sustainable place with urban population of nearly 1.6 billion to 3 billion in 2050. The green cities, energy efficient workplace, safe and resilient cities with smart connectivity will be ruled in knowledge, and it will be educated public servant employing principle of lifelong learning. Thus, we need to address issues of good governance, quality public administration courses offered in many universities and colleges in our region. Cities with universities working hand in hand to promote education for sustainable development will be popular and will enable the new generation of learners to care for planet, making this planet a sustainable place to stay. This is a broader perspective on learning and a strong understanding of education as entangled with life and taking place in different spaces and times towards. As regional integration is being strengthened towards global prosperity, higher education will remain to be the cornerstone and foundation of development. We need more STEM graduates, highly skilled professionals, strong middle-level workers, and quality foundation education from K to 12. We need to push for more recognition, validation, and accreditation of each other's higher education system and qualifications. The Tokyo Convention 2011 and the global recognition of qualifications mandates will help countries to develop a robust national information centers that will help serve the Asia's economic goals, benefiting our countries in this path to prosperity by 2050. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Agnes. This was a very interesting session. I mean, all the 5 speakers, they've spoken from their perspectives from their regions. We started with Carolyn talking about the work of SADC over Africa, and then we also talk about blended learning in Qatar and the different pedagogy being used. Professor Retis and Professor Carmela did talk a lot about responsive pedagogies and the new world of teaching into what are we getting into. And finally, Agnes talked a lot about, again, pedagogies, micro-credentials, STEM, and higher education. And there are quite a lot of, I would say, similarities, even if we are talking about different regions. One message that I've been hearing is definitely that no one should be left behind, and how to be as inclusive as possible, especially after the pandemic, after quite a number of challenges that different regions have faced in different contexts. But then how do we make sure that we are really offering that kind of education and preparing for that education of 2050? Right, with these words, I was checking over some of the questions. So I'm not seeing too many questions. I do see one, which is about free higher education was mentioned as a right. How would developing countries afford this? To spend more money on higher education literally means taking money away from healthcare, housing, social development. And these statements are made, but there are no real and concrete suggestions as to how this should be done. So the floor is open. Carolyn, Jessica, Agnes, and Carmela, anyone who wants to respond to this question?
Yes,
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay. About the right for free education, I think free education will have benefit, and it will balance the cost of them. You know, now the education become more hybrid, so it is less cost. I think there was someone in the previous one of the speakers say it is half or less than half of the cost. You know, increasing, freeing if it is free, then it means that we have more graduate, we have more graduate and more innovation, and also probably, you know, at least the college at the beginning free for certain classes, you know, not necessarily all, you know, those who cannot afford fees, and those who study freely, they have the choice to choose their discipline as well. And this means that it is students, according to students' interest in higher education. And it is, you know, they should also, private sector, private enterprises should contribute to as a service to society. You know, this is a benefit for the whole society to have a high percentage of graduate. So this is my opinion. But anyway, even in the USA, a few years ago, there were some, I think there was, they call for a free education, and they started with some colleges started, and they, it was a free for some colleges, but free for low income and even medium income to attend colleges, and they call also for a future the 4 years colleges.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Ziad, for intervening. I have a question here for Professor Jessica Retis. How is the new Latin scenario impacting or not the production of new content and curriculum for universities in North America? Over to you, Professor Retis.
Thank you for the question. So it's been challenging. But it's moving along. So we have had several very innovative proposals along the way. My current research is on mapping out the offering in general, but the fact that the demographics are changing due to the fact to the US-born Latinx in the United States, it's also somehow providing the context to this new and innovative program. So this is what we're trying to do here at the University of Arizona. Call me romantic, but I'm optimistic about what we can bring if we keep this kind of discussions into academia, into trying to also bring these critical perspectives on how and why we need to embrace the incorporation of cultural responsive, servingness, and also the growth of Hispanic service institutions is actually helping out advance all these critical perspectives in higher education in the United States.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And this really answered the question. I have a comment here in the chat saying that Professor said, good point, that the additional investment needed to ensure the right to higher education is exactly that. Actually, it's an investment. And that's what a lot of people are now trying to put aside by talking about value for money, return on investment, etc. But at the end of the day, it's a long-term investment, especially in terms of social and economic benefit of societies. I think with these comments, I will now close this session. Very interesting session. Thank you very much, all of you, for sharing your experiences, your perspectives. And I think, if I'm not wrong, that you must be in very different time zones, because we're dealing with different regions. So probably some of you are waking up, or some of you are going to sleep. So really, thank you very much for your contributions. Much appreciated. I'm pretty sure
Can I say a word, please? Can I say a word?
Yes, sure,
I just want to apologize for that I attended as participant. And I was expecting that after the introduction, I say thank you and this thing, but you know, the organizer, I think they remind me that I have been attending, and then I mean participant, not a panelist. So I thank you very much and apology for that.
May I say also a word?
Yes,
yes,
sure.
not just it's related with the question of the participant, and I just want to say that higher education is never free. Always is very expensive, especially the good ones. I think the question has to be who has to pay for that. And in many of our developed countries, as mine, as many in my region, there are no poor countries. The problem is not about the amount. The problem is about the distribution. And when we put that public budgets that are necessary, we can't develop higher education without also fight against corruption. Many of our countries have these huge problems that of course has problems related with budgets and with the things that they do, that institutions do with the budget. So I think that they have to come together. Saying that, thank you very much for the opportunity to share this kind of spaces with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, thank you. And of course, we really enjoyed hearing. It's as if virtually we're traveling across the world and we're discovering a lot of experiences, really very enjoyable, very informative. And I'm sure that all these will be like key takeaways for the future of higher education, and especially the one we want to project in 2050. Now, in terms of the program, I can see that there's a transition video on the futures of higher education, collective intelligence for knowledge and learning. But I'm not too sure because I'm being told that there are breakaway sessions after this one. So I would prefer now to hand over to Mpine Makoe to explain how the breakaway sessions will be run. Yes, and a goodbye to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Romila. I think we are going to start with the transition video, and then after that, I will come through to explain how the breakaway sessions will be run.
Sure.
Jade, are you around for the? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you very much. Bye.
Меня зовут Настя, я из России. Мое будущее образование повлияет на меня таким образом. Я буду понимать всю картину мира и пойму, как мы, люди, влияем на экологию. И хочу сказать, что эта проблема, она не вне нас, мы внутри нее. И мы должны перестать быть безразличны к ней и начать заботиться о нашем мире. Мы создаем этот мир.
Hello, my name is Wael. I am from Palestine. I want my next step in education to finish my high school so I can go to university and pursue my goals in studying ophthalmology. I think higher education make people more informed and well educated, so they can create better solutions and come up with better ideas for the current problems we face.
和他人协调合作，了解多元的文化，然后学习新的技术，为未来的可持续发展，为地球的绿色发展做出贡献。
Bueno, yo soy Rodrigo Tejada de Perú, tengo 15 años y bueno, en cuanto a la educación superior, me gustaría que apoye mucho hacia los cambios futuros de las personas y del planeta mediante una mejor concientización de las personas que se hagan cargo de sus acciones. Y además yo creo de que si hay una mejor enseñanza en la educación superior, una persona mientras mayor conocimiento tenga, mayor va a ser su capacidad de ayuda hacia los problemas que enfrentamos actualmente.
Hello, my name is Marie. I am in Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark right now. And my next step in further education is going to be university. And I want all further education, whether it be academic or practical, to be the sustainable lighthouse in their community and in their nation, since they are the homes of greatness and knowledge and passion of youth. So we have to use the bright minds of both teachers and students for something greater. Thank you.
I want to continue my higher education in my home Lebanon in order to participate in the development of our beloved Lebanon and inspire other Lebanese students to do so we can all be change makers. Higher education contributes in the development of one's skills and abilities to prepare him for a bright future that can fulfill his life.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Shireen, je suis du Canada. Puis pour moi, ce que je veux de mon éducation après secondaire, c'est de pouvoir adopter mes passions dans une manière qui m'aide à changer le monde. Ainsi, de pouvoir élargir mes horizons et avoir la capacité de gagner des compétences et de l'expérience plus spécifiques à mes intérêts actuels. Merci.
Nika kama Brilliant Walter na natoka nchini Kenya. Niko katika shule ya kitaifa ya Kapsabet na natumai kuwa daktari nitakapomaliza masomo yangu. Asante.
Phoebe, I'm from New Zealand, and my next steps in education is studying in an international and cooperative program, environmental engineering, hopefully. And I would like universities or higher education institutes to have to change the way they educate students and consider what the main purpose or goal of the education actually is.
Et pour